I'm Nathaniel Shepherd
I'm Ashley Abrams Fitzgerald, and this is Danger Gevaar Ingozi.
for TAF Open Access. Previously I was an artist, but now I specialize in printmaking, and I am also a collage artist.
I studied theatre and I also majored in arts management, and I am the studio manager at DGI.
Chad, Swangiseni, and myself were all printmakers out of David Cribb. We wanted to jump ship and start our own independent printing space because we became completely enthralled by the history of printmaking, especially the Global South's history and the political engagement that printmaking took, most notably silkscreen and relief printing, and the kind of economic role it played in a lot of revolutions. So we wanted to continue that tradition.
DGI is a space in which youth are able to develop the skills that they have and get practical working experience.
We originally had a space in Maboneng, opened up that space in February of 2016. The purpose of that original space was to kind of dive into all of these different printing mediums and the history of print in South Africa, but also to explore and evolve a lot of these mediums and to open up the space to young artists who wouldn't necessarily get a chance at in other institutions. For obvious reasons, such as these are white-owned institutions and they're not necessarily as open to black artists making certain types of work, just more kind of institutionally challenging works. These are certain kind of works and traditions that we like to uphold in the space, and also dismantling a lot of rules associated with printmaking and the arts. We like to pride ourselves on promoting the value of young artists and getting young artists to understand their value as printers, as practitioners, and their worth. Silkscreen and relief printing were very important in South Africa during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, during the state of emergency, where these were economically accessible mediums for people to quickly disseminate ideas and images, counter government, counter apartheid images, and very revolutionary images. And even though we've moved into an era of, very rapid imagery and marketing, to uphold these sort of traditions, to continue those political and social conversations is kind of what our studio strives to do.
What I've really learned about is the value of collective practice, especially at a time where people are not really accessible, and the ways in which you can still facilitate collective practice and have current discussions with people that will be interpreted in their work and that will influence your own practice. With the group show that we recently did, which was called Home for the Holidays, we had 10 artists offer different representations of their understanding of what it means to be an artist now, given the current socio-political context. Everything that they were posing was very interesting for us and really informed how the show came together. And I think it's really important generally, but especially now, to support collective practice and give artists the opportunity not only to create their own work and a space to present their own work, but allow them to create connections with other artists who can inform them in terms of their practice, but also in terms of the industry. And the more youthful or emerging artists also have a freshness that they can offer to the space.
I remember in varsity the idea of a mentor was relief, because you're like, cool, someone vouches for my skills. They have skills that I aspire to have. This is someone that I've been looking at, and now they've accepted this partnership. They can help guide. You almost feel like you won the lottery. You're like, cool, I'm good now. I had my heart broken by a mentor, right? I was so excited to paint under this person. I walked from home all the way to this person's studio. And then the kind of reception that I got, or lack of, and very inappropriate kind of translation of my day took place. I think from there I kind of wrote off mentors for my own practice. Literally the greatest person I could have possibly been mentored by, right, for my practice. And it flopped. I predominantly use printmaking at this kind of phase in my practice. I use predominantly, I guess, relief and silkscreen and intaglio from time to time. My work likes to kind of dig into multiple black histories. So not necessarily the idea of being mixed race, but the idea of being mixed race but black. African American history in relation to a South African history. So my father's African American and my mother's South African, and the kind of shared conversations that you can have with the civil rights movement and apartheid, colonialism and slavery, and labor, the workforce. I use collage predominantly because there's ample media pertaining to Black history, and especially toxic media in the representation of Blackness, blackface, very kind of racialized cartoons and illustrations throughout time. So I like to kind of reappropriate that imagery, and make collage from those. On a practical sense, I'm kind of subverting the purpose of the image, which was intended to kind of suffocate an entire kind of race and skin color. And now I'm changing it into works that I, create as a professional artist. The most important part about printmaking is you're able to create multiples of your work and have an understanding of the economy of your practice as an artist. How many works to make, the value of these works. Starting from like the 90s, we grew up being able to go to like Musica and get posters that were digitally printed. That was like our print culture growing up. These were always digital representations of something real, and a lot of people don't kind of get the tradition of print. Even the idea of the book and why important the physical nature of the book versus the Kindle. With Helena as an Angolan artist, Minnie as a South African artist, Isaac as a Mozambican artist, myself as an African American and South African artist, so many cross conversations. As a printer, you must humble yourself to your own ideas and ideals, but also to be able to facilitate someone else's work. We're also trying to dismantle ideas of using very expensive materials to inflate this false idea of, very valuable works. So all of the works in the show were 1,000 Rand each, no matter where you were in your career. So there was no economic hierarchy within the space. Each edition was of 25, right? So as the printer, if I'm willing to sit and print hundreds and hundreds of prints, that goes to the collection, right? That goes towards the value and the worth of the studio space and the amount of works that can now be disseminated. In the first weekend, someone came in and bought the entire show. But normally if that happens, either the show is completely gone and no one has access to it, but this person was able to take one of each and go home and actually have the entire exhibition, right, in his hands. So access was very important. The amount of people who were able to buy works, the different economic situations people were in to be able to buy these works. So that's sort of like a model that we want to kind of repeat.
Being in a space like Victoria Yards where you get walking traffic, people show a lot of interest because they're not familiar with the form, they've never heard of the form. If you want people to value the art, they need to have an understanding of where does it come from, what's its history.
Important politics is the relationship that the South African public has to labor. So the people who can afford to come to these spaces and patronize these spaces often don't have the most healthy relationship to labor and product because of the history of this kind of country. I have a lot of work on these walls that represent many, many months and years of labor. And that's something that we also kind of make sure we emphasize in the space, is that these things are made by human hands. And the same human hands are the artists, and the same human hands are the owners of the space. Providing a space where people could actually just come off the street and say, here's my portfolio, can I try and make work? I haven't had ample opportunities in other institutions other than this one to make work, right? This is the only place I've been able to wake up and make whatever work I'd like to make. And that is the biggest issue. It's you would think it's the biggest hurdle to make places accessible, but it's the normal old guard that make places inaccessible. It's the reason why I don't work at a David Crip, right? Is it was not accessible for me. And it was blatantly made that way. So spaces I had to, right? But I am now part of a generation of youth, I'm still youth, that have a different sort of self-worth. So we just cannot survive in spaces, whether white or not, that tell you you're not allowed to do a certain thing. That was what sparked this. Chad and I ended up selling our first work from David Crip, but the person who framed our work made more money off of the work than we did. right? Because we split it with the studio. Obviously, the framer got paid the amount for the frame, and then we had to split. I made like, I think 1.5 or something for a print that was like 12,000 rand. And after that, I was like, I'm not trying to hemorrhage money to other people's pockets like that. So it was access for ourselves and access for other artists who were like, okay, cool, it's actually feasible to be a printer. It's not the dumbest decision. It's not the most financially ridiculous thing I've decided to do. These guys are doing it independently. So this is kind of proof that it's possible.
The other thing that we do is workshops. We have very skilled professionals in the space who are able to teach on various levels. And if I'm not mistaken, yourself and Minnie have teaching experience. There are quite a few fine arts students who have not yet graduated, who work in the space as a way to develop their printmaking practice, as a space to have mentorship, and also to understand what is the practical and professional way of working outside of an institution such as a university. That level of access of students being able to walk in and be like, this is where I'm at, this is what I've produced, or I've not been able to produce anything, but these are my ideas, and the kind of discussions that we're able to have with them in order to facilitate a process where they can develop or begin a practice, and the kind of support that there is and the resources in the space to do that. I don't know any other space personally that allows that type of access.
Kids from St. Benedict's who were just so intrigued by how silkscreen worked, how stencils worked. We were still at the kind of, part of the generation of people who made craft, but this generation hasn't seen it before. So once they find out that these things took, skilled labor and mixing of colors and drawing and turning a drawing into a print, how do you convince someone of our age, or in our 30s for those who don't know, to buy work? To say, okay, instead of spending money on like these cakes or these or alcohol bottles, let me buy print and da-da-da-da-da-da. You're collecting your histories, you're collecting your voices. And the archive is very important, making sure that our history is told accurately. When we're trying to uphold this ancient technique, this old technique.
A lot of the work that's created in this space is meant to be discussed. There are deep thought processes behind the images that are created and the printmaking processes that are involved.
And we've had such cool projects, like 10-day intensive projects with Mozambican artists who literally came, printed, didn't have materials in Mozambique, needed to facilitate the printing, and then took it back to his exhibition. Literally printed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of prints. Especially now with Home for the Holidays, we're trying a kind of a different model, but to package these things so that it is easier for students to be able to come in and sit, a little makeshift library and say, okay, cool, I heard about this show. Here's the actual works from the show. Here's digital images from the show. Here's the catalog from the show. Here's the sizes, the ink mixtures, who printed it, when it was printed, how many were printed. And it's to capture all of these annoying details, right? So that by 10, 20, 30 years, you have a very substantial library.
One way in which we were able to archive was that we produced a zine. The zine had kind of a short pretext about what is this exhibition about, who's involved, what are the kind of ideas that surfaced, and then just a short expose of each artist and a detail from their work. So that's something that is going to exist beyond the space.
Photograph every single thing you do, edit it, put it in a file, forget about it. I have photos from when Chad and I studied first year till now, and we still use those photos till this day. A lot of other studio spaces will facilitate the vision of the artist, no questions asked. The collaboration will go as far as like color choices, medium choices, technique, the aesthetics, but not necessarily like confronting you on your politics, right? So there is freedoms within the space, but there's also conversations that are going to be had. So with, like, for instance, Home for the Holidays, all of that work was discussed. It was a conversation. Everything was a conceptual discussion, a practical discussion. The Home for the Holidays, the idea of using the color black was also kind of an interesting discussion. Every artist technically chose black in their work, and then we ended up mixing a color to reinvent the idea of what black is in an image. Right, so none of the works from Home for the Holidays use black out of the tin, because that's not black. right?
You have the responsibility to remain true to the artist. If you're responsible for the kind of environments you're putting an artist in, the kind of way that you're representing them, the kind of networks that you're developing, you need to make sure that that is authentic.
For students, I'm kind of mentoring from a place of, I know a kind of skill set that you would also like to know, and let me help you get to that goal, right? Let me help you facilitate print into your practice. But when it comes to like collaboration with these artists for Home for the Holidays, a lot of them had a lot to teach, as much as we had to teach them about, our ideas of printing. It was less mentoring for the artists and more like a collaboration, more of an acknowledgement of, I have professional skills and you have professional skills and ideas. Let's work for the betterment of this image. Right, let's dedicate our time for this image.
The kind of conversation that develops from there really extends an emerging artist's mind, because you're not yet aware of the possibilities of the art form, but also of what you can do. And I think the encouragement and the support within the space and the culture of the space as being experimental, as being a space where failures can happen, allows people who are still exploring their practice to feel free in that exploration.
It doesn't matter how talented you are, and it does not matter how proficient you are in your techniques. If you're not telling your own story properly, your career can just go. But if you make sure that you are in charge of how it's being represented, who represented, what voice is being told, and not to say you're heavily curating the experience of the studio, but you're just making sure there's no loose ends. You're telling the story that you want to tell, right? Because you have the agency to do it now, finally. Right? A black-run space is nothing to be taken lightly, right? We have the ability to print with whoever we want to print with, for whatever reason we want to print with, and we're highly trained. That's a very dangerous combination for other institutions.